Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we unravel the business complexities at the intersection of environmental, social, and governance issues.
I'm Erika Schiller, and I'm joined by my ClimeCo colleagues, Emma Cox and Anna Stablum.
Get ready to explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy.
From climate action to social responsibility, we're here to decode the ESG landscape by interviewing interesting leading figures across the globe that will empower you with actionable insights.
Whether you're a seasoned practitioner or just embarking on your sustainability journey, this podcast is your compass for navigating the future of responsible business practices.
Let's decode ESG together.
Welcome to ESG Decoded. Today, I'm thrilled to have our guest, Susanne Mathis, on the show. Susanne joined Mondelēz Kraft Foods 20 years ago and has spent her career in marketing, innovation, strategy, and insights. Susanne is now responsible for the ESG reporting and heads up the Sustainable Futures Impact Investment platform. Susanne, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're so happy to have you, and our listeners may not be familiar with Mondelēz as a parent company, but may be very well familiar with the brands that Mondelēz oversees. So we'll get to that in a bit. But Susanne, you have such an interesting background, and I always like to shine a spotlight on the journey that you've taken. You've had a long career with Mondelēz, a very interesting progression in terms of roles, having started working on chocolate at Mondelēz into a bigger leadership role in sustainability. So I'd love to hear from you and for you to share a little bit with our listeners about your journey. How did you get to where you are today? And what were sort of some of the points of influence?
Thank you, Emma. Sure. I have indeed been with Mondelēz for over 20 years by now. And as you said, Emma, I started early on in the marketing department back in Switzerland and was already looking at that time into chocolate brands that we sell across the world. I have then evolved in those marketing roles across regional roles, global roles, but have also changed from marketing into strategy. I have done a stint in consumer insights, and I spend probably the most part also in innovation. So very much focused on, developing new products, improving processes, and being very much connected to the consumer and its needs going forward. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the company has then offered the opportunity for me to join the sustainability team. What they were looking for is connecting sustainability better with the business, with the operations. And innovation was a natural segue because as an innovation manager, you work end to end. You are very involved also in the manufacturing and sourcing of ingredients. So that was a natural connection that I could bring. The rest is history. So I joined and I was starting off with leading the company up to the race to net zero and have now taken on recently the role as ESG reporting.
Wonderful, Susanne. And so I always like to sort of get at the heart of the work a little bit more behind the values that drive your work. And so, obviously in the sustainability profession, we all sort of feel a pull to purpose, right? And so I love to have you share a little bit more about some of the values that maybe drive you in your day-to-day, maybe personal values you grew up with, something you feel passionate about, something that motivates you to get up and go to work every day. What is that drive for you? Or maybe some of the values that you grew up with that sort of influence how you approach your work every day. This is a big job. So would love to sort of hear a little bit more of the personal story from you.
Sure. And I'm glad probably to be in a position that some of my personal motivation also links to the mission that Mondelēz has set out to snacking made right. So I think I believe very much in doing the work right from the beginning and trying to, consider all aspects when we develop product, when we market them, and how we engage with consumer. And that has been something that kept me going in this company. And it may not be perfect all the time, but I think that there is the right intent, there is the right motivation, both for me and my work and how I do my work, but also for the company, how she's trying to, achieve that. And in sustainability, I can go even a step further. I can even try to, design and influence the design of products and the way we approach our operations, that there is a better future for the people and the planet out there.
I love that. And so Snacking Made Right is the sort of platform behind Mondelēz's sustainability. Tell us a little bit more about what makes snacking made right. There's a lot to unpack there, and everybody, I'm sure, can relate to snacking and wants to feel good while doing it. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about the sort of key pillars and focus areas that fall under Snacking Made Right so that we can begin to unpack the pillars behind such a large brand and the efforts that you're making?
Sure. I think Snacking Made Right is really encompassing the entire process, the product, how we make them, how we market them. But maybe to draw this a little bit closer to the work I'm doing in sustainability is really trying to make sure we are focusing our sustainability work on the aspects that really matter most to us, to our business, and to our consumers. And for us, these are three things. One is the sustainable ingredient sourcing, making sure that we have a supply chain of our cocoa, our wheat, the two commodities really that make almost 80% of our business, being the crackers, the biscuits, the chocolates, and having those supply chains in a good shape for the future of our company. Connected to supply chain and our whole operation is our social sustainability, looking after the human rights and the people in our value chain is very important to us, and we take a lot of emphasis on that. Climate and the impact of climate change is something that we feel across. We feel it across our commodities. We have that across our operations, and we are trying to make sure that we reduce that impact as much as possible and prepare the organization for that future. And something that connects us very much with the consumer is circularity, as we call it, or the packaging. So sustainable packaging is where we intersect most directly with the consumers, because ultimately that's what they see first when they meet us. At the same time, that's usually not the way they make their snacking decision, because they want to have a delicious snack and it needs to have the right, fulfill their need in the specific moment. But still, packaging is exactly in that intersection, and therefore packaging is really important to us. And we are trying to evolve and improve as much as we can.
Wonderful. Yes. Let's double click on the packaging a little bit more, because I am very interested. At ClimeCo, we're really starting to dig deeper into empowering consumers to make sustainable and conscious decisions, right? And so, to your point, the packaging is the first thing and the first piece of the snack that the consumer interacts with. So tell us a little bit more about the packaging journey that Mondelēz has been on. Obviously, we all know that packaging is sort of the visible waste that gets discarded after consuming the snack. There's a lot of emissions associated with creating the packaging. A lot of packaging is plastic-based. There's a lot of conversation around microplastics these days. Talk to us about, in your role, you obviously wear an innovation hat. We need a lot of innovation when it comes to packaging and sustainability. So tell us a little bit about what Mondelēz is doing in the packaging space.
Sure, Emma. And I think you brought a broad spectrum of aspects already up. I would say two things when it comes to snacking. One thing is that packaging is essential for us to operate. We need to protect and save our product and the quality of our product so we can reach the consumer at the places they want it. Snacks are usually consumed out and about. They need to be carried on. They go in lunch boxes and different places. So we need to make sure that the product quality and the safety is really at the core. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this connection with the consumer is quite interesting, because as much as it appreciates the safety and the quality of the product, it also has then to deal with the leftover after the snack has been consumed. For us, this is an opportunity and a challenge at the same time. So I think what we have tried to do first is really making sure we reduce the packaging as much as possible. And that sounds obvious, but it's not always. And it takes the consumer to come along. So on the one hand, we, of course, can take packaging out of the supply chain where it doesn't matter to the consumer or he doesn't see it, when we overwrap things. But we also try to shrink the packaging as much as possible towards the consumer. And that's where the consumer needs to kind of come along with us, because size impression is something that we are all very influenced about. And if you shrink a packaging, you reduce the size in the shelf. So that's something where we have had really good examples where either as a first mover or as a whole category, we have made efforts to move along and say, okay, we take out these plastic elements, we move to different materials altogether. And the consumer was happily accepting that because it became more conscious about that as well. The other places where we need to technically replace, or we want to replace a material, for example, plastic with something else. And there we as a company work very closely with the consumer in the development of the material, not so much the technical part, but the perception and the communication. And that's, I think, is very important for consumers to understand. Now, as I said, we operate mostly with flexible plastic. Flexible plastic has proven to be one of the most efficient and effective materials for food packaging. It's light, it's safe, it protects the product. So we are trying where we can to eliminate it or replace it, but we're also conscious that we don't want to introduce another material that has other issues further down. It might not be the microplastic issue, but it may be a other sustainability related issue or even a carbon issue. If the packaging becomes heavier, you increase your carbon emissions and so forth. So it's quite of a process to come to that, what a better packaging looks like. I think as a principle for us, having packaging that's fully recyclable or designed to be fully recyclable is an essence. And I think we are on a very good path. We have 96% of our materials already qualified for that, meaning the consumer can, where it's available, put it in the right recycling bin. And that's the first step for circular economy, that it goes into the flow. And that's, I think, where we as a company can start and have to start. And this is where we work with the consumer so they can then go in. Maybe also for you to know, we are working with the consumer directly. We just launched early in the year a program in the Nordic countries in Europe to really, through a digital device, encourage consumers to even select and segregate the materials even further, and they will be incentivized to do that. And it's really a great success. The brands get very engaged. It's a very active exchange between the brand and the consumer. So there's opportunity to really drive brand value, but at the same time improve the packaging and bring innovation along as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Susanne. Lots of great things going on. One sort of question in my mind is, how far in circularity can we go if the infrastructure for recycling isn't farther along, right? Especially here in the US, we know that recycling has its issues and there's not a lot we can do from a consumer standpoint, but what can a company like Mondelēz do to influence the improvement of that infrastructure? And what are you doing, if anything?
Oh, we are definitely doing something, because for us, this is equally an issue. One is because it makes our whole efforts obsolete if the product cannot be recycled. And you're right. And secondly, don't underestimate, we need these recycling streams to basically fuel the circularity. We need those, plastics to return so we can bring them back into our PETs or our recycled plastics. Therefore, we have already for years done probably two things that stand out. One is we have really been very active with peer companies and through industry coalitions to encourage governments to invest in recycling and collection in the community. We have done that in the US, we have done that in other markets, and we are seeing that this is driving definitely some change. The other part we have done as a company is we have made investments into investment funds, technically, or companies that drive collection and recycling. We have focused those investments particularly in regions which even further challenged on the infrastructure, particularly Southeast Asia and Latin America. And through those investments and funds, we are really starting to build up the capability and the capacity from the ground. So we are building, recycling centers. We are building new technologies that can be deployed. And in combination with the peer and the advocacy with the government, that system should hopefully start to, really scale up and fall into place to the benefit of all of us.
Thank you so much for that overview. It does sound like Mondelēz is trying to influence all the points, and it will take a coalition and scale, I'm sure, and partnership across both private and public sectors. So it's great that you've been doing that and working on that for some time. I believe we'll have to continue to invest in that space. Wonderful. So, Susanne, I do want to get a little bit into another part of your role, which is impact reporting. And this is a space that is near and dear to ClimeCo's heart. We do a lot of support in this arena. We know that companies are being held to specific expectations around disclosure, reporting. We have heard a lot of feedback in the industry that it's become a huge lift for companies to be reporting and disclosing so frequently and at such a volume. At the same time, I think the industry agrees that a certain level of disclosure is needed, right? So how, in your role, do you strike the right balance in terms of reporting? And what is your general approach to reporting with Mondelēz?
I think as a commercial organization, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And so I think reporting, and which is ultimately measuring what you're doing, is essential to us and has been part of our sustainability work since the beginning. What has definitely increased is the amount of public reporting or regulatory required reporting. And I think in principle for us, the fact that this is coming is not so much a trouble because we have most of the data available. We have been working on that. We are collecting that. There's maybe two things that make that a little tricky. One is if there's different reporting standards and reporting requirements across different jurisdictions. We as a company are a global company. We operate in all regions basically. And that makes it hard. If there is different standards and different rules and different, ways to calculate things, because there is a risk of inconsistencies. There is a risk of numbers getting mixed up, and by the way, how they read them versus how they cut them. So on top of, it's a humongous workload to prepare these data. And if you need to cut and slice them in all different ways, that creates additional work that in my view has no value because it's just cutting the data. So that's something that's definitely has been challenging, and we are working diligently to understand and make sure we are following, but we are also pushing to make sure there is some simplification, harmonization where possible.
That's great. Yeah, I was at a conference recently, Susanne, where a large company, well-known company, made a statement on the stage. They said that they were investing more at some times in disclosure than they were in the actual impact initiative, which really struck a chord, I think, with the audience to realize, are we investing in the right places, right? If we have such a long way to go in terms of, reaching our ambitious climate goals, how are we going to get there if we're not appropriately balancing our impact investment? And I think this is so relevant to the work that you're doing, and the right balance has to be struck.
I totally agree. Fortunately, that's not yet the case in Mondelēz. We're still doing a lot more work than what we need the effort to report it. But it is cumbersome. And I think it's financially, it absorbs money to, get the data with all the additional, third-party assurance. But it's also for the team that working on the programs, they want to make sure that the programs grow and flourish. And sometimes, you drag them back because you need to go them. At the same time, I think there is a certain rigor we need in the numbers. And I think this is, in my view, what needs to pan out over the next 1 or 2 years max, I hope, to really strike the right balance between what is reasonable to report versus, what, to your point, is just an overburden and defeats the purpose, because companies eventually or organizations will stop the work because it's not worth the effort with all the additional reporting you need to do. So I think we are a bit of on a tipping point. So we need to make sure that we strike that balance right to not lose the efforts, to your point, and drive too much frustration and diversion of funding to the wrong end, I would say. As I call it in my team, if we spend more money in collecting than we do, then that's difficult.
And Susanne, how do you think we'll be able to strike that balance? Because it takes all stakeholders to have the conversation, right? I mean, you have the agencies that are governing disclosure. You have, private companies that are needing to disclose. You have regulators. So how do you get all those folks in a room? Are those conversations happening? Are they doing anything? Where do you see us in 5 years from now? Do you think we will reach sort of that right balance where we're making a lot of progress and disclosing the right amount so that it doesn't take up so much so much time and resources at the company level?
Emma, I'm generally optimistic. And I would ground it on two things. One is we're seeing, for example, in Europe, which probably has the most active, reporting discussion at the moment, that there is some efforts to really drive simplification and bring those actors together. And the way that the Commission is doing it at the moment is really trying to bring the different stakeholders that you mentioned on the table. And so they're talking to companies to understand what's the effort. They're talking to NGOs, and obviously they're a government body on its own to make sure that they're still pursuing their objective that they're trying to achieve. So I'm hopeful that with some of the simplifications that we hope to see in EU, that will set a standard, as I said earlier, that can also be adopted by others as a reasonable level for reporting. The other place I think we may benefit is there is technology and systems improving as we are preparing for those regulations. The way we collect the data, the way we manage the data. We in our organization put a lot of effort into automation, into digitalization of some of those systems. And ultimately, it's a little cumbersome today, but to your point, may make things easier in the future. And that is probably the two areas where I hope if they work out well, both kind of the regulatory bodies finding a reasonable place, as well as, the companies and the technology, leveling up their reporting capabilities, we should land in a good place that then can be taken forward, both in scale, but also across the world.
Fantastic. So, Susanne, I want to come back a little bit to the consumer journey because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a space that we're really interested in, believe that the consumer can drive a lot of demand in terms of sustainability with their purchasing power, right? So if they see, some sort of a badge that signals a sustainable product, it will influence them to buy that sustainable product, right? We've actually seen a 12% sales lift on just the Amazon Climate Pledge Friendly program alone, which is their badging program. So it's really sort of confirming and validating that theory that a badged product gets consumers to buy more. So back to sort of, your products and what you're seeing from consumers, because I know your role used to at least focus a bit on consumer insights. So talk to us about sort of the evolution of consumers demanding or consumers' preference for a sustainable product. What are you hearing from your consumers? And then how are you implementing what you're hearing within your sustainability initiatives?
Yes, you're right. The consumer is a key piece. And I keep telling every one of us is a consumer to one or another category. And so back to our categories, for talking mostly about chocolate and biscuits and pastries or cakes, sustainability remains a top consideration, or, in some cases, it's called a concern for consumer. And that's even though things like inflation and, political turmoil rise up and kind of, maybe make the space a little tighter in the top ranks. But particularly for areas like packaging and some of the ingredients, sourcing, sustainability remains quite critical, both for chocolate as well as for biscuits and baked snacks. And this is good for us because it means the consumer is still there and we can continue our journey. You're right. There is what we in the industry calls the kind of, the value action gap. So the consumer values sustainability and, as I said, reports that in surveys as important to them. When it comes down their purchase decision, and snacks is probably a little pronounced for that, other drivers influence strongly. You buy your perfect chocolate because you like the chocolate and not because probably the packaging or, some of the things around it. And this is, I think, what we work with the brands with, to make sure that the key drivers of the categories remain taste and preference, taste preference. There's no doubt about that. But how can we attach sustainability as a co-benefit to those products and those bundles? And to your point, have more and more consumers, acknowledge that and, maybe make or change the decision trees going forward. That could be something we work on. And this is what we're trying to do. Now, it is obviously in today's world quite complicated to bring these messages to the consumer, and sustainability has an additional complication because it's not easy sometimes to explain. So yes, you're right, we can put badges on it and so forth, but it is not as easy. And start with packaging and recycling. It's yes, recycling, but in other places, for example, there are different recycling streams. So which one does it go? So it needs to be very descriptive. This is go this. So it becomes quite cumbersome and complicated. And then that's when consumers tend to zoom out because they're like, this was just about the snack. And
right. You have to make it easy for them. And
you have to make it easy. So we are working, and I think this is really where I would say our efforts with the brands and is really focused on. One is on the development side, to develop the product in the first place that it's more sustainable. And then in the consequence, how can we communicate that and how can we position that to the consumer in an efficient and effective way? And I can't report that we have been winning all fronts. I think we are making small progress here and there. And I think this is also an area where I think as consumers evolve, as the category evolves, we will see more understanding, more awareness, and this will help drive more sustainable product purchases.
I hope so. I really have a lot of hope in the future generations and the demand that they will signal in their purchasing decisions. So fantastic. Well, thank you, Susanne, for that answer. And I want to get a little bit into a bit of a heavier subject here, which is around climate and emissions. Recently we heard from David Suzuki that we had lost the climate fight. Right. And so there's been a lot of chatter about that in the industry. It's easy to sort of get into the doom and gloom of the work in terms of it being such a large gap that we need to cover. We have a lot of progress to make, and we look a lot to government. We look a lot to the private sector. But I think there's a lot of power in the scale behind a brand like Mondelēz. And I know Mondelēz cannot do it alone. There's a lot of collaboration that has to happen. But talk to us a little bit about how you're thinking about that gap and the initiatives and efforts that you're making to fill it within your own footprint.
Yes, and I may take a step back just to give listeners a context what carbon means for food and beverage companies more broadly. So think about 70% of our footprint comes from raw materials. So agriculture materials in our case that we source to then manufacture our chocolates or cookies. In effect, only 5% of our carbon footprint is down to our manufacturing network. So all the baking of the cookie, and so it's less than 5% of our carbon footprint. And same goes for packaging. So we have really the bulk of our carbon footprint in what we call Scope 3, and within that specifically into raw materials. In our case, it's mostly agriculture materials, as I said, and I think we are glad that I think over the last couple of years, we have already made quite some efforts to reduce the carbon emission or, decarbonization in some of the key commodities. Coming back to our two key commodities, remember, was cocoa for our chocolates, and then wheat, for example. The key driver for cocoa is deforestation. So if you look at the carbon footprint for cocoa, it's primarily dominated by the deforestation that has happened or is unfortunately still happening in some geographies. And with our Cocoa Life program, Mondelēz has over 12 years been working with the communities to halt and protect forests and make sure that they grow cocoa on land that has not seen deforestation recently. And I think that's the good news for us as a company. We have this, year-long effort with the community, with the farmers, and addressing these deforestation issues. And so have pretty good results when it comes to our carbon emissions from cocoa. The other part is wheat for our cookies. Wheat, fortunately, comes with a relatively low carbon footprint. There, it's really more regen ag that can help us, further decrease the carbon. And also there, we are making good progress. Even some brands have started to get involved with Triscuit here in the US. We are running some regen ag programs with farmer out in Michigan, and this will continue to grow. But I think back to your point, how do we drive these decarbonization? The good news is that it's a value chain. So it needs everybody to come along to do it. It doesn't make sense nor a difference if one player alone does it, because I'm working with my scope 3 and I'm scope 3 for my next retailer. So we are all connected. And I think that I have the hope and also the experience that drives really more significant progress than would have expected, looking at that from a very kind of neutral place. And so we as a company, we work with our suppliers to really address that. And at the same time, we also approach by our retailers to help them reduce their carbon emission. And so as it tickles down, I think we are making progress. We as a company reported 12% reduction in 24, which is a progress. And we're on a good path to our 2030 goal, which is minus 35%.
Wow. Yeah, those sound like very aggressive goals. So I'm really happy to hear that Mondelēz is taking it seriously, and that's good progress. We're seeing a lot of sort of negative progress and reporting from a lot of companies. So congratulations on that effort. I know it's not easy, and it will take a lot of cross-sector collaboration, right? And we've been seeing a lot of that too. I'm sure you're in touch with a lot of your sort of agriculture colleagues and co-opetition, as we call it. So reaching across the aisle and really collaborating on initiatives that can drive scale. So wonderful to hear. Thank you, Susanne. All right, we're nearing the end of our time, unfortunately, together. This has been a wonderful and informative discussion. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about what Mondelēz is doing in sustainability. Let's have some fun now. I would love to sort of do a little bit of a rapid fire fun round with you. And my first question is a fun one, and hopefully you can rattle one off quickly. But what is your favorite snack, Susanne?
It's chocolate.
Perfect. What is an ESG buzzword that you would retire?
I think green hushing. I think there's really nothing good about that. I mean, if you do the good work, you must and should be able to talk about the work. I'm not a fan of that at all.
I love that one. I've talked about green hushing quite a bit on my episodes. Okay, and finally, what is a sustainability myth that you would bust?
The perception that sustainability or eco-friendly products don't work or don't work as well. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I definitely know for all our snack products, if they're made more sustainably, they do taste exactly the same, if not better. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence out there that says eco-friendly products are worse.
I like that. Wonderful. Okay, now I would like to give you the mic, Susanne, for any sort of closing thoughts. This is a platform that we like to extend to you, Susanne, as a person and also as a representative of Mondelēz. So please take it away. The mic is yours, and we'll give you a little bit of time to send your parting thoughts.
Thank you, Emma. I want to maybe circle back to where we started, and you asked me about my motivation and why I'm here and doing what I'm doing. And it's summarized in the best way with the quote that I read years ago that says, "The greatest threat to our planet is to believe that somebody else is going to save it." And reading that, listening to that, and contemplating on that made me really conscious that I play a role here and I want to play a role. And that's why I'm doing the work I'm doing. And it's little steps, but they all, in my view, go in the right direction. And I'm happy to be able to be in the position to do that every day, and hope I can continue it further. And invite everybody, all our listeners, to look for little steps they can make as well towards a more sustainable future. And I think it will be a better place for all of us.
That's a great message. This work is truly selfless. And it's so important that we think outside of our own spheres. There's so much going on outside of our world. So let's think in a worldly way. So I love that message. Thank you so much, Susanne. Thank you so much for being on the show and for sharing all of your wonderful wisdom with our listeners.
Thank you, Emma. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to ESG Decoded. We hope this episode has inspired you to take action in your own ESG journey, stimulating ideas for partnership and innovation.
New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday morning. Subscribe now on your favorite streaming platform to stay in the loop.
Join the conversation on social media using @ESG Decoded or visit ClimeCo.com for more resources.
Until next time, keep decoding, keep innovating, and keep making a positive impact.